The poor maid breastfeeds the millionaire boss's baby, but he surprises her and makes a decision. But before telling this story, subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Continuing. The rain drummed against the tall windows of the Georgian mansion in Kensington, each droplet like a tiny hammer against Sarah's already fragile heart. At 24, she moved through the grand hallways with the quiet precision of someone who had learned to make herself invisible, her footsteps muffled by expensive Persian rugs that cost more than she had ever earned in a year. Sarah Miller had been working as a housekeeper for the Whitmore family for 3 months now, ever since she had desperately needed to escape the suffocating memories of her small flat in South London, the flat where she had prepared a nursery that would never be used, where tiny clothes still hung in a wardrobe she couldn't bear to open, where the silence echoed with phantom cries that existed only in her dreams. Her body hadn't forgotten. Even now, as she dusted the ornate mantelpiece in the drawing room, she could feel the persistent ache in her chest, the physical reminder of a loss so profound it had no name. The doctors had been clinical about it, using words like natural process and hormonal adjustment, but they couldn't explain the way her arms felt perpetually empty, reaching for something that wasn't there. The Whitmore mansion was a fortress of marble and mahogany, where every surface gleamed with the kind of perfection that money could buy. But money, Sarah had learned, couldn't buy the things that mattered most. It couldn't buy happiness, and it certainly couldn't buy love. The house felt as hollow as her heart, despite its grandeur. James Whitmore was rarely home. When he was, he moved like a man under water, weighed down by grief and responsibility in equal measure. His wife, Charlotte, had passed away just 3 months after giving birth to their son, Oliver. A sudden illness, the kind that reminded everyone how fragile life truly was. James had thrown himself into his work at the investment firm, staying late into the evening, taking calls that stretched into the night. Anything to avoid the reality waiting for him at home. And then there was Oliver. Sweet, beautiful, innocent Oliver, who had inherited his mother's delicate features and his father's dark eyes. At 2 months old, he should have been the center of his father's universe, but instead he had become a reminder of everything James had lost. The baby's cries seemed to echo through the vast house like accusations, each wail a testament to the father's inability to connect with his own child. Mrs. Thompson, the nanny James had hired, was supposed to fill the gap. She came with impeccable references, spoke in crisp, professional tones, and charged fees that would have supported a family for months. But Sarah had begun to notice things. The way Mrs. Thompson's smile never quite reached her eyes. The way she would disappear for hours at a time, claiming she needed to fetch special formula from a pharmacy across town. The way Oliver's cries seemed to go on longer when she was supposedly caring for him. This particular Thursday afternoon, as Sarah worked her way through the second floor, she heard it again. That desperate, heartbreaking wail that seemed to come from the depths of a small soul in distress. It was coming from the nursery, a room decorated in soft blues and whites, filled with expensive toys and equipment that seemed more like museum pieces than items meant for a child. She paused in the doorway, her heart clenching at the sight before her. Oliver lay in his crib, his tiny face red and blotchy from crying, his little fists clenched as if he were fighting an invisible enemy. The room reeked of sour milk, and Sarah could see a bottle sitting on the windowsill, its contents clearly spoiled from sitting in the afternoon sun. Mrs. Thompson was nowhere to be seen. Sarah's maternal instincts, which she had tried so hard to bury, surged to the surface like water breaking through a dam. She approached the crib slowly, her hands trembling as she reached for the crying infant. The moment she lifted him, Oliver's cries intensified, but there was something different about them now. They weren't just cries of hunger or discomfort. They were cries of recognition, of a need that went deeper than food or clean clothes. "Where is she?" Sarah whispered to the empty room, her voice barely audible over Oliver's wails. "Where is the woman who's supposed to be taking care of you?" She had noticed the pattern over the past few weeks. Mrs. Thompson would announce she was going to the shops, or to collect special medication, or to speak with a pediatric specialist, but Sarah had seen her from the upstairs windows, climbing into expensive cars with men who definitely weren't doctors. She had seen her return hours later, sometimes with shopping bags from luxury stores, sometimes with nothing at all except the faint smell of wine on her breath. Oliver's crying was becoming weaker now, more desperate. Sarah could see the signs of dehydration in his listless movements, the way his skin seemed loose on his tiny frame. Her heart broke a little more with each labored breath he took. She knew what she had to do. The knowledge came not from her mind, but from somewhere deeper, more primal, from a place where loss and love intertwined like dancing flames. Moving to the comfortable chair by the window, Sarah settled herself carefully, cradling Oliver against her chest. She could feel her own heartbeat, steady and strong, and somehow it seemed to calm the baby slightly. His cries softened to whimpers, then to small, exhausted gasps. The decision wasn't really a decision at all, it was instinct, pure and undeniable. Sarah lifted her shirt and brought Oliver to her breast, her body responding to his need with the same natural grace that had sustained women for centuries. The moment his tiny mouth found what it sought, the silence that followed was profound. For the first time in months, Sarah felt peace. Not the absence of pain, but something bigger than pain. As Oliver fed, his tiny hand curled against her chest, right over her heart. She watched his eyes flutter closed, his breathing become steady and deep. This was what her body had been preparing for, what her heart had been yearning for, not to replace what she had lost, but to channel that love towards someone who desperately needed it. The afternoon light streaming through the nursery windows seemed softer somehow, golden and warm. For perhaps 20 minutes, the world felt right again. Sarah found herself humming softly, an old lullaby her own mother had sung to her, watching as Oliver's face relaxed into the peaceful expression of a truly contented child. She didn't hear the footsteps on the stairs. She didn't hear the nursery door open. She only became aware she wasn't alone when she heard the sharp intake of breath behind her. Sarah turned to find James Whitmore standing in the doorway, his briefcase fallen from nerveless fingers. His face a mixture of shock, confusion, and something else she couldn't quite identify. His eyes moved from her face to the baby in her arms, taking in the scene with the stunned silence of a man witnessing something he couldn't quite process. For a moment that stretched like eternity, neither of them spoke. Oliver continued to feed peacefully, oblivious to the tension crackling in the air around him. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, suddenly aware of how this must look, how impossible it would be to explain. She began, then stopped, unsure how to put into words something that went beyond explanation. James stepped into the room, his movements careful and measured, as if he were approaching something fragile that might shatter at any moment. His eyes never left his son's face, and Sarah saw something there that hadn't been present in all the months she had worked in this house. She saw recognition. She saw a father seeing his child, really seeing him, for the first time. "He was crying," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Mrs. Thompson was gone, and he was so hungry, and the formula had gone bad in the sun, and She trailed off, realizing how inadequate words were to describe what had driven her to this moment. How could she explain the way her body had responded to Oliver's distress? How could she make him understand that this wasn't about overstepping boundaries or presuming to take someone else's place, but about answering a call that came from the deepest part of her being? James moved closer, and she could see the emotion working in his face. Not anger as she had feared, but something more complex, something that looked almost like relief. "How long has he been settled like this?" James asked quietly, his voice rough with an emotion Sarah couldn't name. "About 20 minutes, she replied, her arms instinctively tightening around Oliver. "He was so distressed when I found him. I've never seen a baby cry like that." James nodded slowly, running a hand through his dark hair. "He's been like this for weeks. Nothing we try seems to help. The doctors say he's healthy, but—" He paused, his eyes meeting Sarah's for the first time since he'd entered the room. "But he never looks like this. Peaceful, I mean. Content." The weight of his words settled between them, like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Sarah felt something shift in the atmosphere of the room, a recognition that this moment was bigger than either of them had anticipated. "Where is Mrs. Thompson?" James asked, though his tone suggested he might already suspect the answer. Sarah hesitated, torn between loyalty to a fellow employee and concern for the child in her arms. She said she was going to get special formula. "That was 4 hours ago." James's jaw tightened, and Sarah saw anger flash across his features, not directed at her, but at a situation that had been allowed to continue for far too long. 4 hours, he repeated, the words heavy with implication. Oliver stirred slightly, making the small, contented sounds of a satisfied baby. Both adults looked down at him, and Sarah felt the moment crystallize into something that would change everything. She just didn't know how much or in what ways her world was about to shift on its axis. The sound of heels clicking on marble echoed from downstairs, and Sarah felt her stomach clench with dread. Mrs. Thompson had returned, and somehow Sarah knew that her presence in this room, in this position, was about to become something very different from the simple act of compassion it had begun as. James heard the footsteps too, and his expression hardened. "Stay here," he told Sarah quietly. "Don't move. Don't let anyone tell you that what you did was wrong." But as the footsteps grew closer, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that rightness and wrongness weren't going to matter in the storm that was about to break over their heads. All she could do was hold Oliver closer and hope that somehow the peace of this moment would be enough to carry them through whatever came next. The clicking of heels on marble grew louder, each step like a countdown to disaster. Sarah could feel her heart hammering against her ribs as she held Oliver closer, the baby still peaceful in her arms, unaware that his contentment was about to shatter the careful facade that had been holding this household together. Mrs. Thompson appeared in the nursery doorway like a figure from a nightmare, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair slightly disheveled, her cheeks flushed from what Sarah could now clearly smell was wine. Her designer handbag hung from her shoulder, stuffed with shopping bags from expensive boutiques rather than the pharmacy she claimed to have visited. "What on earth?" Mrs. Thompson's voice trailed off as she took in the scene before her. Her eyes widened, moving from Sarah's face to the baby at her breast, then to James standing nearby with his jaw clenched in barely controlled fury. The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Oliver stirred slightly, sensing the tension in the room even in his sleep, but didn't wake. His tiny fist remained curled against Sarah's chest, a gesture so innocent and trusting that it made what happened next feel like a violation. "This is absolutely inappropriate," Mrs. Thompson declared, her voice sharp with a combination of panic and righteous indignation. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm shocked that you would allow such a thing to happen in your home." James stepped forward, and Sarah could see the careful control he was exercising over his temper. When he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. "Where have you been for the past 4 hours, Mrs. Thompson?" "I told you I was at the specialty pharmacy across town, getting Oliver's new formula. The traffic was terrible, and there was a delay with the prescription." The lies rolled off her tongue with practiced ease, but Sarah could see the desperation in her eyes. "Oliver doesn't have any special prescriptions," James said flatly. "I would know. I'm his father." Mrs. Thompson's composure began to crack. "Well, I consulted with a pediatric specialist about his feeding difficulties and—" "Stop!" James's voice cut through her stammering like a blade. "Just stop lying. My son was crying for hours. He was dehydrated. The formula you left had spoiled in the sun." He gestured toward the windowsill where the sour-smelling bottle still sat. If Sarah hadn't been here, if Sarah hadn't overstepped her boundaries in the most shocking way possible," Mrs. Thompson interrupted, her voice rising to a pitch that made Oliver stir restlessly. "Mr. Whitmore, surely you can see how utterly inappropriate this is. A housemaid breastfeeding your child? What will people think?" The words hit the room like a physical blow. Sarah felt the shame wash over her in waves, not because she regretted what she had done, but because she could suddenly see it through the lens Mrs. Thompson was holding up. What had felt like the most natural thing in the world now seemed somehow sordid, inappropriate, wrong. "People will think that someone in this house actually cares about Oliver's well-being," James replied. But Sarah could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. The social implications were beginning to sink in, and she watched as the relief and gratitude she had seen in his eyes began to war with something else: fear, of judgment, of scandal, of what this would mean for his reputation, his business, his standing in the community. Mrs. Thompson sensed the shift immediately, like a predator scenting weakness. "Mr. Whitmore, I understand you've been under tremendous stress since Charlotte's passing. We all have, but surely you can see that you can. This woman has taken advantage of your grief, of your absence, to insert herself into a role that isn't hers to fill." Sarah felt the words like physical blows. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that it hadn't been manipulation or opportunism that had driven her to feed Oliver, but pure instinct and compassion. But looking at James's face, watching him struggle with the weight of social expectation, She began to understand that the truth might not matter. "She saved my son's life," James said, but his voice lacked conviction now. Oliver was suffering, and she helped him. By creating a completely inappropriate bond, Mrs. Thompson pressed on relentlessly, by inserting herself into the most intimate aspect of childcare. "Mr. Whitmore, what happens when word of this gets out? What happens when your late wife's family learns that the housemaid is wet nursing their grandson? What will they think? What will your colleagues think?" James ran his hands through his hair, and Sarah could see the exact moment when social pressure won over paternal instinct. The transformation was subtle, but devastating, like watching a light go out behind his eyes. "Sarah," he said quietly, not meeting her gaze, Perhaps we should discuss this privately." But Mrs. Thompson wasn't finished. Now that she sensed victory, she pressed her advantage with ruthless efficiency. "Mr. Whitmore, I hate to be the one to suggest this, but you have to consider the implications. A young woman, recently bereaved herself, becoming inappropriately attached to your child, creating dependency. What if she becomes possessive? What if she starts to see Oliver as a replacement for her own loss?" The words were like poison, seeping into the cracks that grief and exhaustion had already created in James's judgment. Sarah watched in horror as he began to nod slowly, as if Mrs. Thompson's twisted logic was beginning to make sense to him. "That's not what this is," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "I would never." "Of course you wouldn't mean to," Mrs. Thompson said with false sympathy, "but grief makes people do irrational things. And Mr. Whitmore, think about what this looks like from the outside. A young woman working in your home so soon after your wife's passing, now in such an intimate position with your child. People will talk. They'll make assumptions." Sarah felt the walls of the beautiful nursery closing in around her. She could see exactly where this was heading, could feel the current of social expectation and propriety pulling James away from the moment of connection they had shared. The peaceful interlude when he had seen his son truly content for the first time was being rewritten as something shameful, something to be hidden and denied. Oliver began to fuss, sensing the tension in Sarah's body. She instinctively began to rock him gently, murmuring soft sounds of comfort, and for a moment the rightness of it was so obvious that even Mrs. Thompson fell silent. But the moment passed, and the nanny recovered quickly. "You see," she said triumphantly, "already she acts as if the child belongs to her. Mr. Whitmore, for Oliver's sake, for your family's sake, this situation needs to be addressed immediately." James was quiet for a long time, staring at his son in Sarah's arms. She could see the battle raging behind his eyes, could almost hear his thoughts warring between what his heart told him was right and what his social conditioning insisted was proper. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. "Sarah, I think it might be best if you found other employment." The words hit her like a physical blow. She had expected them, but that didn't lessen their impact. Oliver stirred in her arms and she realized that her hands were shaking. "Mr. Whitmore," she began, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. Oliver needs stability," he interrupted, but he still couldn't meet her eyes. He needs normal arrangements. Professional arrangements." Mrs. Thompson smiled triumphantly. "I'll contact the agency tomorrow. We'll find someone more suitable, someone who understands appropriate boundaries." Sarah looked down at Oliver one last time, memorizing the way his tiny hand curled against her chest, the peaceful expression on his face, the trust in his sleeping features. She kissed his forehead gently, breathing in his sweet baby scent, knowing it might be the last time she would hold him. "When?" she asked quietly, carefully transferring Oliver to his father's awkward arms. The baby immediately began to fuss, sensing the change, missing the warmth and security he had found with Sarah. "Tonight," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll provide references, of course, and 2 weeks severance pay." Sarah almost laughed at the inadequacy of it. References for what? For caring too much? For letting her maternal instincts override social propriety? For feeding a hungry child when no one else would? "Keep your references," she said quietly, gathering what little dignity she had left. "I don't think they would help me anyway." As she moved toward the door, Mrs. Thompson stepped aside with exaggerated politeness, her smile sharp as a knife. "I'm sure you understand, dear. It's nothing personal. It's just what's best for everyone." Sarah paused in the doorway, listening to Oliver's increasingly distressed cries as James tried unsuccessfully to comfort him. She wanted to turn back, to take the baby from his father's inexperienced arms to finish what she had started, but she could see in James's face that the decision had been made, that social pressure had won over paternal love, and that there was nothing she could say or do that would change his mind. "Take care of him," she said simply, her words meant for James, but her eyes on Mrs. Thompson. "Whatever else happens, please take care of him." Then she was walking down the hall, down the grand staircase, past the expensive artwork and gleaming surfaces that had never felt like home anyway. Her few belongings fit easily into the single suitcase she had brought with her 3 months ago, and within an hour she was standing on the front steps of the Whitmore mansion, looking out at the London street that stretched before her like a question mark. The rain had stopped, but the October air was sharp with the promise of winter. Sarah pulled her thin coat tighter around her shoulders and began to walk, carrying her suitcase and the memory of Oliver's weight in her arms. Behind her, she could still hear the baby's cries echoing through the expensive windows, and she knew that Mrs. Thompson's victory was going to taste bitter indeed. She had nowhere to go, no family to take her in, no friends who could offer more than temporary sympathy. The small savings she had managed to accumulate during her months of employment would last perhaps 2 weeks if she was careful. After that, London was a big city with many dark corners where people like her could disappear entirely. But as she walked through the gathering dusk, Sarah carried with her the memory of 20 perfect minutes when she had felt like herself again, when her loss had been transformed into love, when her empty arms had held exactly what they were meant to hold. It wasn't enough to keep her warm or fed or housed, but it was something. It was proof that love existed, even in the most broken places, even when the world refused to recognize it. The city swallowed her up, like a stone dropped into deep water, and behind her, the Whitmore mansion glowed with warm lights that no longer included her. The first night was the hardest. Sarah found herself huddled in the doorway of a closed bookshop in Camden, her thin coat providing little protection against the October chill that seemed to seep into her very bones. The streets of London had a different face after dark, one that was harder and less forgiving than the polished facade it wore during daylight hours. She had tried the hostels first, but they were full, and the waiting list stretched for weeks. The few pounds she had in her purse wouldn't stretch to even the cheapest hotel room, not when she needed to save every penny for food. So she learned, as so many had learned before her, that the city could swallow you whole if you didn't have enough money to stay afloat. 3 days passed in a blur of hunger and exhaustion. Sarah discovered the cruel mathematics of homelessness, that food was a luxury when you had no address, no income, no prospects. She haunted the areas around employment agencies, but without references, without a permanent address, without the polished appearance that employers expected. Door after door closed in her face. But it wasn't the hunger that tormented her most during those long, cold nights. It was the memory of Oliver's weight in her arms, the way his tiny hand had curled against her chest, the perfect trust in his sleeping face. She would close her eyes and feel phantom sensations, her body still responding to a maternal call that had nowhere to go. Her milk had not yet dried up, and the physical discomfort was a constant reminder of what she had lost not once but twice. Meanwhile, across the city, in the warmth and luxury of the Kensington mansion, a different kind of suffering was unfolding. Oliver had not stopped crying since Sarah left, not for more than a few minutes at a time, and never with the deep, peaceful contentment he had shown in her arms. James had hired a new nanny within 24 hours, a stern woman in her 50s with impeccable credentials and a no-nonsense approach to childcare. Mrs. Patterson came highly recommended, with testimonials from some of London's most prominent families. She arrived with her own special formulas, her own carefully structured feeding schedules, her own theories about infant discipline and routine. None of it worked. Oliver refused every bottle, pushing them away with the desperate strength that only a hungry baby could muster. He would take just enough to survive, but no more, and even then he would vomit most of it back up, his tiny body rejecting what it was offered. Mrs. Patterson tried different formulas, different bottles, different feeding positions. She consulted with pediatric specialists and nutritionists. She implemented strict schedules and soothing routines, but Oliver continued to cry with a sound that seemed to come from the depths of his small soul, a wail that spoke of loss and longing in ways that no adult could fully understand. "He's grieving," the third pediatrician told James, after a thorough examination revealed nothing physically wrong with the child. Babies can form attachments more quickly than we sometimes realize, and when those attachments are severed, the doctor's words hung in the air like an accusation. James found himself thinking of Sarah constantly, remembering the peaceful silence that had filled the nursery when she held his son, the way Oliver's entire body had relaxed in her arms. He had told himself that dismissing her was the right decision, the proper decision, the only decision a responsible father could make. But watching his son waste away before his eyes, James began to question everything. Mrs. Thompson, meanwhile, seemed increasingly nervous as Oliver's condition worsened. She had expected to resume her previous arrangement once Sarah was out of the picture, but Mrs. Patterson's presence made her own negligence impossible to hide. The new nanny was professional, vigilant, and utterly intolerant of anything less than complete dedication to Oliver's care. "Perhaps we should consider a different approach," Mrs. Thompson suggested during one of their brief encounters in the hallway. "Maybe a younger nanny, someone more flexible in their methods." But James was no longer listening to her suggestions. Something had shifted in him during the sleepless nights spent watching his son suffer, something that made him see Mrs. Thompson's self-serving advice for exactly what it was. By the end of the first week, Oliver had lost weight he couldn't afford to lose. His crying had become weaker, more desperate, and sometimes he would go for hours without making any sound at all, lying in his crib with eyes that seemed too large for his pale face. "Mr. Whitmore," Mrs. Patterson said one evening, her professional composure finally cracking, "I've cared for children for over 30 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this. He's not just refusing food, he's refusing comfort itself. It's as if he's given up hope." That night, James sat in the nursery watching his son sleep fitfully, and he made a decision that went against every instinct of self-preservation he possessed. He picked up his phone and began making calls. The first was to his private investigator, a discreet man who had helped him with sensitive business matters in the past. "I need you to find someone," James said quietly. "A woman named Sarah Miller. She worked for me briefly as a housekeeper." The second call was harder. It was to his late wife's mother, a formidable woman who had never approved of his parenting methods and who would undoubtedly have strong opinions about what he was about to tell her. "Eleanor," he said when she answered, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to listen to the whole story before you respond." The conversation that followed was difficult, painful, and brutally honest. James told his mother-in-law everything, about Mrs. Thompson's negligence, about finding Sarah feeding Oliver, about the social pressure that had driven him to dismiss her, and about his son's decline since she left. Eleanor Hartwell had been many things during her 72 years on Earth, but she had never been a fool. When James finished his story, she was quiet for a long moment. "You're telling me," she said finally, "that you dismissed the one person who could comfort my grandson because you were worried about appearances. Eleanor, you don't understand the implications. I understand that my grandson is suffering," she cut him off sharply. "I understand that Charlotte would be ashamed of you right now, and I understand that if you don't fix this immediately, you're going to lose that child in ways that have nothing to do with his health." The rebuke hit harder because it was true. James had spent so much time worrying about what people would think, about protecting his reputation and social standing, that he had forgotten the most basic truth of parenthood. A child's well-being came before everything else. The search for Sarah took 3 days. London was a vast city with countless hidden corners where someone could disappear if they didn't want to be found. The private investigator checked hostels, shelters, employment agencies, anywhere a young woman in desperate circumstances might turn for help. They found her on a Thursday morning under Waterloo Bridge, huddled in a sleeping bag that had seen better days, her face gaunt with hunger and exhaustion. She was awake when they approached, but barely responsive, her eyes holding the distant look of someone who had been pushed beyond their limits. James had come personally, despite his investigator's advice to let him handle the initial contact. When Sarah saw him approaching, she didn't run or hide. She simply watched him with weary resignation, as if she had always known this moment would come. "Sarah," he said, dropping to his knees beside her makeshift bed. "I'm sorry, I'm so deeply, truly sorry." She didn't respond immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse from days of cold and limited use. "How is he?" James's voice broke. He's dying, Sarah. Not physically, but the doctors say he's dying of sadness. He won't eat, won't be comforted. It's been 2 weeks and he's just fading away. Sarah closed her eyes and James saw tears leak from beneath her lashes. I told you to take care of him. I thought I was. I thought I was protecting him from gossip, from scandal. I thought I was doing what a responsible father should do. James reached out tentatively, then stopped, his hand hovering in the air between them. I was wrong about everything. About you, about what happened, about what mattered most. Why are you here, Mr. Whitmore? Sarah asked, opening her eyes to look at him directly. What do you want from me? I want you to save my son's life, he said simply. Again. I know I have no right to ask after what I did to you, after how I treated you, but Oliver needs you. And I think I'm finally ready to stand up to anyone who has a problem with that. Sarah studied his face for a long moment, seeing something there that hadn't been present 2 weeks ago. Desperation, yes, but also a kind of clarity that came from having one's priorities forcibly rearranged by crisis. The people who judged us before, she said quietly. They'll judge us again, probably worse this time. Let them, James replied, and there was steel in his voice now. Let them say whatever they want. My son is more important than their opinions. Sarah was quiet for so long that James began to fear she would refuse. When she finally spoke, her words were barely audible above the sound of traffic passing overhead. I'm not doing this for you, she said. I want you to understand that. I'm not doing this because you've apologized or because you've seen the error of your ways. I'm doing this because somewhere in this city, there's a baby who needs someone to love him unconditionally, and I can't live with myself if I don't try. James nodded, understanding the distinction and accepting it. Whatever your reasons, I'm grateful. Don't be grateful yet, Sarah said, struggling to sit up. We don't know if he'll even remember me. We don't know if what we had before can be rebuilt. But as James helped her to her feet as they made their way toward his waiting car, both of them knew that some bonds went deeper than memory, deeper than time or circumstance or social judgment. Some bonds were written in the language of the heart itself, and no amount of separation could truly break them. The drive to the hospital was silent, except for Sarah's quiet question. Is he very ill? He will be, James replied honestly, if we don't reach him soon. And in that moment, racing through the London streets with Sarah beside him, James understood that he was about to find out whether love really could conquer the damage that fear and pride had inflicted, whether a bond forged in 20 minutes of perfect peace could be strong enough to heal 2 weeks of separation and suffering. The answer waited for them in a hospital room, in the arms of a baby who had been crying for the only mother his heart had ever known. St. Mary's Hospital buzzed with the controlled chaos of a busy pediatric ward, but in room 314, an unusual kind of silence had settled. Oliver lay in his hospital crib, connected to monitors that tracked his weakening vital signs, his tiny body so still that the medical staff had begun preparing James for conversations no parent should ever have to endure. Sarah stood in the doorway for a moment, her heart breaking at the sight of the baby who had filled her dreams for 2 weeks. Oliver looked so much smaller than she remembered, his face pale and drawn, his breathing shallow. The robust infant who had relaxed so completely in her arms seemed to have faded like a flower deprived of sunlight. He hasn't responded to anyone, the nurse whispered to James. We've tried everything the doctors recommended. Different formulas, feeding tubes, even had a child psychologist consult on the case, but he just... She trailed off as Sarah moved toward the crib, her steps careful and deliberate. The room seemed to hold its breath as she reached down and gently lifted Oliver from his bed, cradling him against her chest with the same natural grace she had shown 2 weeks ago. For a moment, nothing happened. Oliver remained limp in her arms, his eyes closed, his breathing unchanged. Sarah felt a stab of panic. What if it was too late? What if the bond they had shared had been broken by separation and suffering? Then, like a miracle unfolding in slow motion, Oliver's eyes fluttered open. His gaze found Sarah's face and something shifted in his expression. Recognition flickered there, followed by something that looked almost like relief. His tiny hand moved, seeking and finding the fabric of her shirt, clutching it with surprising strength. "Hello, sweet boy," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with tears. "I'm here. I'm so sorry I was away, but I'm here now." Oliver's response was immediate and profound. His body, which had been rigid with distress for days, melted into hers with complete trust. The monitors beside the bed began registering changes almost instantly. His heart rate stabilized, his breathing deepened, his blood pressure normalized. The nurse who had been attending him stared in amazement. "I've never seen anything like this," she murmured to James. "It's as if her presence is literally bringing him back to life." James watched from across the room, his own heart breaking and healing simultaneously. He had thought he understood love before, but watching Sarah with his son, seeing the immediate and complete trust between them, he realized he was witnessing something far beyond his previous comprehension. "Are you hungry, darling?" Sarah asked softly, settling into the chair beside Oliver's crib. Without hesitation, she began to feed him, and this time there were no questions of appropriateness or social convention. There was only a baby who had been starving for more than nourishment, and a woman whose body and heart responded to his need with the same instinctive certainty that had first brought them together. Oliver fed with desperate hunger, his small hands pressed against Sarah's chest as if he were afraid she might disappear again. When he was finally satisfied, he didn't release his grip on her shirt. Instead, he fell into the first peaceful sleep he had experienced since she left, his breathing deep and steady, his face relaxed into the expression of absolute security that only comes from being exactly where you belong. The transformation was so dramatic that within hours doctors were calling it unprecedented. Oliver's vital signs returned to normal ranges, his color improved, and when he woke from his nap, he was alert and responsive in ways he hadn't been for weeks. But the real test came the next morning, when Mrs. Thompson arrived at the hospital. She swept into the room with her usual air of authority, clearly expecting to find James alone and vulnerable, ready to be convinced once again that social propriety mattered more than his son's well-being. Instead, she found Sarah in the chair beside Oliver's crib, the baby content in her arms, and James standing beside them with an expression she had never seen before. "Mr. Whitmore," Mrs. Thompson began, her voice sharp with disapproval. "Surely you can see that this situation is even more impossible now, bringing her to a public hospital where anyone might see my son finally healthy and happy," James interrupted quietly. "Where anyone might witness the fact that Sarah Miller saved Oliver's life not once but twice." Mrs. Thompson's face flushed with anger and panic. "You're making a terrible mistake. Think about what this will do to your reputation, to your business relationships, to your late wife's memory." "My late wife would want her son to be loved and cared for," James replied, his voice steady and sure. "And if my business relationships can't survive me doing what's best for my child, then they weren't worth having in the first place." Sarah looked up from Oliver, surprised by the conviction in James's voice. This was not the same man who had dismissed her 2 weeks ago. Something fundamental had changed in him during his son's illness, something that had transformed uncertainty into unshakable resolve. "You're going to regret this," Mrs. Thompson said, her mask of professional concern finally slipping to reveal the calculated self-interest beneath. "When the scandal breaks, when people start talking, when your precious reputation is in ruins, you'll remember that I tried to warn you. The only thing I regret," James said calmly, "is listening to you in the first place. Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the premises." Mrs. Thompson's departure created a ripple of gossip that spread through London's social circles with predictable speed. James had anticipated this, and he met it head-on with a strategy that surprised everyone who knew him. He wrote a detailed account of everything that had happened, holding nothing back. He posted it on every social media platform he used, sent it to local newspapers, and shared it with anyone who would listen. The post began simply, "My name is James Whitmore, and I want to tell you about the woman who saved my son's life." The response was overwhelming, but not in the way Mrs. Thompson had predicted. Instead of scandal and condemnation, the story generated an outpouring of support and admiration. Parents shared their own stories of unconventional childcare arrangements. Medical professionals commented on the importance of emotional bonding in infant development. Social workers praised Sarah's instinctive response to a child in need. The story went viral within days, spawning articles in major publications and interviews on television programs. But Sarah declined every media request, every offer to capitalize on her newfound fame. Her focus remained entirely on Oliver, who continued to thrive in ways that amazed everyone who saw him. The legal process of formalizing Sarah's role in Oliver's life was complex, but not impossible. James hired the best family lawyers in London, and together they navigated the intricate web of adoption procedures and custody arrangements. There was resistance from some members of James's extended family, concern from social services about the unconventional nature of their arrangement, and skepticism from judges who had never encountered a case quite like theirs. But Oliver's remarkable recovery spoke louder than any legal argument. Medical experts testified about the clear evidence of secure attachment between Sarah and the child. Child psychologists explained the profound impact of early bonding on infant development. Slowly, steadily, the legal system began to recognize what anyone who spent 5 minutes with Sarah and Oliver could see. They belonged together. The adoption process took 6 months, during which Sarah lived in a flat James provided near the hospital, close enough to spend every day with Oliver, but maintaining her own independence. She refused his offers of financial support beyond what was necessary for Oliver's care, insisting on finding her own part-time work once Oliver was stable enough to allow it. During those months, something unexpected began to develop between the adults. It wasn't romance, at least not in any conventional sense. It was something deeper and more complicated. A partnership built on shared commitment to Oliver's well-being, mutual respect earned through crisis, and a gradual recognition that their individual healing was somehow intertwined. James learned to change diapers and prepare bottles, to sing lullabies and soothe nighttime fears. He began leaving work early, turning down evening meetings, restructuring his priorities around a tiny person who needed him to be present rather than successful. Sarah watched this transformation with cautious appreciation, seeing glimpses of the father Oliver deserved. Sarah, meanwhile, slowly began to reclaim pieces of herself that had been lost in grief. Caring for Oliver didn't erase her own loss, but it gave her pain a purpose, a direction. She found that loving him didn't diminish the love she had carried for her own child. Instead, it seemed to honor that love by channeling it towards someone who desperately needed it. The day the adoption was finalized was quietly celebrated in the same hospital room where Sarah had first reunited with Oliver. Judge Margaret Sinclair, a woman known for her no-nonsense approach to family law, had reviewed every aspect of their case with meticulous care. "In 30 years on the bench," Judge Sinclair said as she signed the final papers, "I have rarely seen such clear evidence of a child's well-being being so dependent on a specific caregiver. Sarah Miller, you are now legally recognized as Oliver Whitmore's mother in every sense that matters." The transformation in their living situation was gradual but inevitable. Sarah moved into the Whitmore mansion not as an employee, but as Oliver's mother and James's co-parent. They maintained separate bedrooms, separate lives in many ways, but they shared the profound responsibility of raising a child who had brought them together through circumstances neither could have imagined. There were challenges, of course, moments of tension when their different approaches to parenting clashed, times when the unusual nature of their relationship felt too complicated to navigate. But they learned to communicate with the same careful attention they both devoted to Oliver's needs, creating a family structure that was unconventional but undeniably strong. 2 years later, as Sarah sat in the garden behind the mansion, watching 3-year-old Oliver play with the toy cars James had bought him, she reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. Oliver ran toward her with a scraped knee and the confident expectation that she would make everything better, just as he had been running to her for comfort since that first day in the hospital. James appeared in the garden doorway, having arrived home early from another meeting he had cut short for Oliver's sake. He had been doing that more and more lately, building a life that prioritized presence over profit, relationship over reputation. "How was your day, love?" he asked. And Sarah knew he was speaking to both of them, to the small family they had created from loss and love and stubborn determination. "Perfect," Oliver declared, abandoning his cars to scramble into James's arms. "Mummy and I made biscuits, and I only ate 3 before lunch, and we read the story about the dragon twice." James laughed, lifting his son high into the air, and Sarah felt that familiar warmth in her chest, the sense of rightness that had sustained her through all the difficult moments. This wasn't the family any of them had originally planned, but it was the family they had chosen, fought for, and built together, one day at a time. The gossip had long since died down, replaced by respect for a family that had faced judgment with dignity and emerged stronger. Sarah had eventually returned to school, studying early childhood development, with Oliver playing nearby in university childcare. James had restructured his business to allow for the flexibility that active parenting required. They had both learned that the most important decisions in life couldn't be made based on what other people might think, but only on what love demanded. As the sun set over London, casting long shadows across their garden, Sarah knew that their story would continue to unfold in ways none of them could predict. But she also knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, bound by something stronger than convention or expectation, the unbreakable connection between a child and the people who had chosen to love him unconditionally. Oliver fell asleep that night as he always did, curled between his parents in the big bed that had become their family's gathering place, his small hands clutching both of theirs as if to keep them all anchored together. And in that moment, listening to his peaceful breathing, Sarah understood that some families weren't born but made, forged in crisis and tempered by choice, stronger for having been tested and found unbreakable. The love that had begun in 20 minutes of perfect peace had grown into something that would last a lifetime. It wasn't the story any of them had written for themselves, but it was the story they had written together, and that made all the difference.